Whether you call it Kveik, Kvik, or Kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. When designing a beer recipe, there are a number of considerations the brewer must take, decisions that are going to have a palpable impact on the ultimate character of the finished beer, one of which involves selecting which hops to use. Indeed, the style of beer one is brewing will have some influence on this selection, but given the vast number of varieties available today, it can sometimes be a confusing and difficult task. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss a couple hops known particularly for being used in cleaner lager styles, Tettnanger and Spalter Select, is contributor Will Lovell.
So I love Noble and Noble-esque hops, and sometimes you get around to wondering, I'm out of this one hop. Can we substitute in this other one? Will it really create a very similar beer? And so doing things like comparing hops like Tettnanger and Spalter Select seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do to me.
Yeah, absolutely. As a lover of clean pale lager myself, I've brewed with both of these varieties many times. In fact, I'm sure some of our longtime listeners have probably heard me say that Tettnanger is among my favorite hops of all time. I absolutely love the stuff. That said, this opinion is admittedly based largely on my anecdotal experiences, and I've often wondered just how different this favorite hop of mine is from other similar varieties like Spalter Select. I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this today, Will, as well as going over the results of your experiment where you compared beers made with both of these varieties. If you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in January of 2024, just a couple of weeks from now, is the guy behind the best brewing magazine of all time, Brew Your Own magazine, as well as Winemaker magazine, Brad Ring. Anyone involved in brewing definitely knows about Brew Your Own magazine, which is published by Bat and Kill Communications, a company that Brad is the president of. In addition to their awesome publications, Brad hosts the annual Brew Your Own Boot Camp, which if you have an opportunity to attend this, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a lot of fun. To be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, no later than Friday, January 26th, 2024, as Brad is going to be taking those questions on Saturday, the 27th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When you're shopping online, your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup. Both of these systems are absolutely awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewer starting kits. So whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Shane Cantrell wrote in with some general feedback and a question. So Shane says, first off, I'd like to say thank you. I jumped into this hobby in the mid-90s, and needless to say, it was rough. Very little info available. I had the Joy of Brewing book and the guy at the homebrew shop. Both were very helpful, yet very limited. So needless to say, I made mediocre beer that took an exorbitant amount of time to brew, and the bottles were filled with yeast cake. It was very disheartening. I threw my hands up and walked away from it after a few extract batches. Then, in 2016, a friend friend got me back into it and turned me onto your podcast, which led me to Brew in a Bag. Over the years, your podcast has helped me tremendously in learning a lot of new techniques that have saved me so much time and really helped me understand what I'm doing. Now I brew beer that I'm quite happy with, so again, thanks. One question. I brewed a Smash, a single malt and single hop beer, using 100% Maris Otter and Willamette hops, fermented with Nottingham yeast, and I'm wondering what style it is. English IPA, some sort of bitter, or is it just beer? What do you think, Will?
So, first of all, thank you for listening and supporting the show. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate all of our listeners. So thank you for that. I'm glad that you got back into the hobby after such a hiatus, and I'm glad Brewing the Bag's working out for you. But a Smash beer with Willamette and Maris Otter sounds pretty delicious, actually.
It is.
I would say. I think you just made basically a pale ale of sorts, depending on your IBUs and everything else. So I don't know if it fits specifically into an English bitter category or not. I'd have to look at the specs, but you just made a nice pale ale of sorts.
Yeah. I'm with you, Will. I don't fancy myself a proud person, but I got to say it feels really good to know that what we're doing is contributing in some way to other people enjoying this hobby. Having started around the same time you did, Shane, I know all too well the frustration it sounds like you experienced, and I'm so glad you've been able to make some changes that have improved your experience. That is really, really rad. As for your question, though, I'm not too hardcore about stylistic accuracy. That's not something I hang my hat up on, but I personally tend to base the style selection, or what I'm calling a beer, on a few things. For example, if you went with a fairly moderate hopping regimen, I'd probably call it a blonde ale. If you went more heavy-handed with the hops, perhaps it fits better as an American pale ale, unless it's a bit higher strength, and then, at which point it would be like an IPA. Either way, as long as you liked it, that's what matters. I really do appreciate you writing in, letting us know that we've been a good influence on you. That makes us feel pretty good. So if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you're not already subscribed to the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, please go do it right now at youtube.com/@The Brewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show with no umlauts. In addition to being notified when new episodes drop, which a little birdie tells me may be more often in the very near future, it'll also help us hit our completely meaningless goal of getting 20,000 subscribers by our 1-year anniversary, which is just a couple weeks from now, and we are less than 200 subscribers away. So that'd be really awesome if you helped us out. All right, we'll be back talking about Tettnanger and Spalter Select hops after this break. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. So I was recently cleaning up my computer and came across a folder that had all of my old beer recipes in it. This was before I started using recipe design software, so they were in Word documents. The first one being the Irish Red Ale that I brewed way back in February of 2003, and I saw that it actually included a mid-boil edition of Tettnanger. Well, in the 2 decades since then, I've used this lovely hop so many times and have developed quite the infatuation with it. I've also used Spalter Select many times and think it's pretty great as well, albeit different, at least based on my own anecdotal experience. Will, what do you say we start with some background on these two varieties before we start comparing the two?
I would love to. So let's start with Tettnanger. Tettnanger is, as we call it, a noble hop, and there are 4 noble hops in case you're interested. Satz, Hallertau, Spalt, and of course Tettnanger. Of the 4, it's there's some research to, suggest that Salt, Spalter, and Tettnanger have a similar genetic lineage and were likely crossbred at some point in time. And so these are called the Sautzer hops for their similarities. And so maybe an interesting point of terroir and how that can affect things. And then also another thing to note is if you ever see American Tettnanger, this is actually Fuggle. Stay away from it. You don't really want that. It's not an actual Tettnanger. But it goes back to, so these hops were, I guess you'd call them landrace because they weren't purposely bred, right? They were just discovered in Germany, so probably some wild origin. Again, we don't know, but records indicate they've been cultivated for 200 years or so. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love stories like the thing about noble hops is that they are, I think all four of them, Satz, Hallertau, Spalt, and Tettnanger are all landrace varieties, meaning they weren't purposefully bred, like you mentioned. Which is so cool to think. I mean, there's no way for us to compare Tettnanger from the 1800s to Tettnanger from 2024. But how cool I would love to know how different that hop is now, compared to what it was when they originally found it and started using it to make beer. But yeah, it is an original variety. And like you said, I read some places that, I'm sure there are some hop farms here who have actually taken real Tettnanger and grown it, but I don't know if they're calling it American Tettnanger or not. But I read the same thing, that it's just Fuggle that's grown over here in the States, or a weird like Fuggle bred, blend type of hop. I'm not sure, but to me, these hops are Fuggle and Tettnanger are just wildly different.
I mean, terroir, who knows? And who knows, like somebody brought it over and started growing it and thought it was Tettnanger and turned out to be Fuggle.
Yeah.
Like you never really know. So, but yeah, just stay away from the American stuff. But otherwise, these four noble hops that we've been talking about, including Tettnanger, are some of my favorite to use, and especially in lagers, and they're really fantastic. So do you want to jump into the stats?
Yeah, well, yeah. So we'll get into the stats. The thing to keep in mind is that, the old school way of thinking about hop usage was that anything added at 60 minutes was purely for bittering. Anything added mid-boil around the 30-minute mark was purely for flavor. And anything added after 15 minutes, with 15 minutes left in the boil, was purely for aroma, right? I don't hear anybody referring to it in those terms anymore. But I think it's important to keep in mind that all of the noble hops are relatively lower alpha acid, so they don't pack a huge bittering punch, and they tend to be viewed largely as aroma varieties. And so that's why as we move into the stats, we're going to be focusing more on some of the aromatic qualities of these, but we know that also contributes flavor, and we know that these hops absolutely can be used for bittering as well. In fact, I think the common approach to making most pale lagers these days is to use just a single hop variety, often noble hop, for bittering, flavor, aroma for every bit. But they are technically viewed or termed aroma hops because of their primary usage for contributing that aromatic and flavor quality to these particularly lager styles of beer. So in terms of stats for Tettnanger, we're looking at about 2.5 to 5.5% alpha acid. I've had Tettnanger. I think this is just purely memory, but I think the highest alpha acid Tettnanger I've ever picked up was in the 4.5% range. And you're using at least 28 grams an ounce or so at 60 minutes just to get the bitterness where you want in that beer. I've never seen Tettnanger as high as 5.5%, but I'm sure it's out there. I don't know. Have you used something that high? Do you recall?
I've never seen it at 5.5. I've seen it, like you said, 3.5, 4.5, somewhere in that range. I think my latest bag that I used in the recipe we talk about later was like 2.2%. So I think there's a lot of droughts and things going on in Germany that I think are driving some of these statistics down a little bit and affecting the harvest. And I'm sure the really good stuff that's of that higher alpha acidity is probably staying in Germany.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, that they're keeping the good stuff, for themselves.
That's what I would do. And they obviously make a lot of German pills, and some of the best German pills I've ever had has just been a lot of Pilsner malt, stacked with Tettnanger. So
yeah, God, I love Tettnanger. So a little disclaimer: neither Will nor I fancy ourselves hop experts, right? We've been brewing long enough to have just enough knowledge to be dangerous, but we are not by any means trying to spin ourselves as knowing more than we do about this. So if we make some mistakes, feel free to email us. I'm sure you will, anyways. But also know that most of our information is from the school of Google here. So and experience, of course. So in terms of some of the more prominent characteristics or stats about Tettnanger, let's start with cohumulone. Now, cohumulone, my understanding of what we'll call CoH, is that it doesn't have much. A lot of people used to say that higher cohumulone hops will impart a more harsh bitterness. We've done tests on that, and it's you cannot get two hops of the same exact variety that have different CoH levels. That's just an impossibility when you're buying from Yakima Valley Hops. And so the only way to test that out, and this is an aside, but is to get two hops that have arguably somewhat similar characteristics, perceptible characteristics, one being high CoH, the other being low CoH. That experiment that we did, we can get to in another episode, but it did seem to suggest that the cohumulone level does have an impact on perceptible bitterness. I think that's kind of interesting. So Tettnanger, to keep that in mind, has between 22 and 28% CoH, which is about, to me, that's about average. That's not too high. It's also not terribly low. You look at something like Simcoe, and I think that averages something around 18 to 20% CoH, whereas something like Chinook is up there in the 30% range. So this kind of falls somewhere in the middle. Nothing that I would be worried about in using it for bittering.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, CoH is there. I guess another one is, we can talk about myrcene for a minute, which is where you get that generic like hoppy green note. It's one of those things that I'm guessing when you cut out some of that leafy material, maybe it kind of goes with it, but this one is usually spec'd at about 20 to 35% myrcene. And if you're comparing that to something like Citra, you're getting more like 60 to 65% of the total oils are myrcene.
Yeah. So myrcene is the most prominent, overall, the most prominent terpene that is in, I believe it's a terpene, present in hops as well as cannabis. Anybody out there who enjoys partaking in the cousin of hops, the smell of myrcene very well. And it is very prominent. So you're going to see that listed on every, hop variety out there if you're digging into it. Like you said, it does seem to range between something like 20 and 60% or so. Tettnanger, 20 to 35%. So you're going to get that nice, just, when somebody says, man, it smells like hops, or if you're in Yakima Valley during hop harvest, you're smelling largely myrcene. That's that nice green hoppy note. Another terpene very common in hops is humulene. And we are not going to get into every single one of these, because that would just take way too long, but the more prominent ones. Humulene, now in my research, I found that humulene is responsible for contributing kind of an herbal, dank, that again is that kind of cannabis smelling thing. It contributes that to beer, and Tettnanger has between 22 and 32% of that. I know that it can also, people say that it can contribute kind of a spiciness to beer. Will, in your reading, did you see anything different?
So what's funny is my Google degree said attributed woody and spiced more to humulene, but again, I think some of this is, there's a lot of overlap in these things.
Yeah.
And again, we're not hop scientists, so I'm sure there's some overlap in some of these things, because again, spice can come from lots of different kind of places inside of these terpenes and oils that are inside of the hops. So my Google degree a little bit different. I think it contributed the dank more to the
caryophyllene, I believe is how you say that.
Caryophyllene. Yes. Maybe I should have had Google pronounce that for me before I got on the show. And it kind of gave more of that herbal dank to the caryophyllene, but who knows? I certainly don't.
Yeah, we're just going to go with what we learned online here. So now both of those, humulene, caryophyllene, let's just say that both contribute on some level an herbal, danky, spicy note to beer. So again, humulene, you're at 22 to 32% of the total oils for Tettnanger, and then caryophyllene is between 6 and 11%. And then the big one, and this is one we have to pay attention to when it comes to Tettnanger, is farnesene, which contributes that kind of floral, sweet fruit, woody, earthy type of thing to beer. In fact, in my research, I found that they use this terpene for like aromatherapy and stuff to kind of add that nice kind of woodsy note to like candles and such. So Tettnanger contains 16 to 20% of its hop oils are farnesene. That's pretty high. You look at other more modern, like IPA hops, and it is significantly lower than that, down into the 1% or less range. So there's something about Tettnanger that has this farnesene that we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'm looking at Citra right now, and it's less than 1% of the total oil. So the fact that this is so high, 16-24%, is pretty awesome. And I use this particular terpene for aromatherapy as well every time I open up a can of Hans Pils. So
That's perfect. While you're in the bathtub drinking a nice Pilsner that has a high farnesene count to it.
Exactly.
So for both of these hops, we did do hop chronicles on it, which means that we collected data from tasters who had no idea what the hop used in the beers were, and we had them just rate the. We don't have a hop chronicles series on this for this show, but we had them rate different descriptors, and then we compile all that data. So what we're going to go over just a little bit, again, not too detailed, is just the most prominent and least prominent aromatic and flavor compounds or descriptors that the blind tasters in these hop chronicles rated. So for Tettnanger, the most prominent aromatic compound was the three most prominent were, I keep saying compound, what I mean is descriptors. Spicy herbal was number 1, earthy woody was number 2, and pine was number 3. What that kind of lines up for me, that spicy herbal, earthy woody thing with the high farnesene, that seems to make sense to me.
Right. And this is obviously, especially the spicy herbal, earthy woody, that's what a lot of people associate with Tettnang. So it's no real surprise that those are highly rated.
Yeah. And when my personal experience with Tettnang, and one of the things that I love so much about it isn't so much the characteristic it imparts, but the pungency of those characteristics. And to me, it allows me to kind of better evaluate what it is. And to me, I get this kind of pungent, like floral, spicy, earthy thing all blended together that it's so unique and so good. That's why it's one of my favorites. Now, thankfully, some less common aromatic descriptors that were rated are some that you might not necessarily want in a nice pale lager: berry, onion, garlic, and oddly citrus. So those were the three lowest rated aroma descriptors by blind tasters. What do you think about that, Will?
I think that lines up, and I actually got to taste the beer where this data came from, and that lines up kind of with where I was. I didn't get any berry, garlic, or citrus in the aroma. I don't know that most noble hops give off too much citrus in the aroma, but sometimes you can taste it in the flavor profile. Yeah,
which is very weird because that was the number in terms of flavor. We all know that what you smell often aligns with what you end up tasting. But as we found with a lot of hop varieties, that the aromatic qualities do often tend to differ from the flavor quality. So in terms of the flavor alone, the most endorsed descriptors were citrus, number 1, apple pear, number 2, and spicy herbal. One thing we have to keep in mind with this, and it's what I consider every time we're analyzing the data for a hop chronicles, is that when you're tasting it, you're getting a lot more than just the hops. You're getting the yeast character, you're getting the malt character, and a lot of people I've heard describe Pilsner malt as having kind of a white grape skin type of character, very subtle, maybe a little bit of a pear thing. So who knows if that's necessarily specific to the hop, but I think that lines up. Citrus, apple pear, spicy herbal was still in the top 3, and they were all pretty close. The least prominent flavor descriptors, the lowest rated, were onion, garlic, berry, and dank caddy. Again, that all lines up for me.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that I think apple pear, especially in the pale lager series, I think that it gets selected quite a bit actually. So I do agree that with low hopping rates, there's something about it where people are picking up this kind of apple pear note that probably is coming from the malt or something else. So that's or the yeast even. It's just very fascinating. But again, your palate can't really discern, well, this is hops. Well, this is yeast. Well, this is malt. So you're just going with what you have there. And so I think it gives us, maybe not a perfect idea, but a really good idea about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So in terms of the beer styles that Tettnanger is going to work the best in, as rated by tasters in our Hop Chronicles, we're looking at, pale lager styles, blonde ale, pale ale, Belgian ale, British bitter, Weiss beer, and even sour ale. It is a really good hop to use for if you're going with a more subtle, delicate style of beer. You can go with just Tettnanger throughout the whole thing, like a nice pale lager. If you're making something like an IPA, to throw in a little bit of Tettnanger midway through the boil, or if you want a little bit something to go along with the citrusy stuff from your Galaxy or Citra, use a little bit of Tettnanger, toward the end of the boil or even in your dry hop. You can really get a nice, unique hop character from that. So again, my personal experience with Tettnanger is that it tends to have this interesting pungency to it that I find very, very desirable.
I kind of describe it. It just produces really good beer flavored beer.
Yeah,
and I don't know, like when I drank that beer that we just described, all the survey data for it, it just tasted like good beer to me. I love using Tettnanger, especially in lager styles like Helles, because again, it just creates that wonderful beer flavored beer. What else could you ask for? You could use it in some Belgian ales. I've seen noble hops used in Belgian ales before. Obviously it's got a lot more range than we give it credit for. I think I might want to try it in maybe an English bitter or something like that on the down the road, just see what it does.
Absolutely. That's the thing. I think people tend to kind of categorize hops based on the region they're grown or the style of beer they're most associated with. But the reality is all hops share most things in common. So, use some noble hops for an English bitter, use, English hops for a nice American IPA. You can totally do that kind of stuff. It's how you figure out, new ways to do things that could be very unique. So now moving on to Spalter Select. One thing that we have to point out is that this is not to be confused with Spalt hops. Spalt hops is one of the 4 original noble hops. Spalter Select is not. So this hop was actually bred at the Huell Institute or Hop Research Center and released in 1993. So it's only been around for 20 years, 20 years now or so, or 30 years? Jeez, my knees. They bred this by crossing Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Spalt hops. So they took 2 noble hops, mommy and daddy here, 2 noble hops, put those 2 together, and the offspring was Spalter Select. Part of the purpose for them doing this was to create a noble-esque variety that had better disease tolerance than its parents, which they achieved, though you can still very easily or readily find Hallertau Mittelfrüh and Spalt hops. It's not like they stopped producing those. But the idea, again, was to have something unique, try something new, and Spalter Select was the outcome. Like Tettnanger, it is viewed largely as being an aroma variety, but it can be used for multiple purposes. I think, it falls within that same alpha acid range as Tettnanger. You can find Spalter Select that has a little bit higher alpha than your average Tettnanger. But other than that, in terms of bittering, flavor, and aroma, it's supposed to be somewhat similar.
Yeah, it does get kind of lumped in with kind of the noble-esque hops just because of its mommy and daddy being, who they are. And so it's, I have a little bit of trouble finding Spalt, like normal Spalts. I know it's out there, but like if you go to Yakima Valley Hops, I didn't see it on their website this morning, but you can get Spalter Select almost any time. So it's often listed as a substitute for Spalt, which again, because of mommy and daddy, you can see why it would do that. It's not a horrible landing spot. And you also see like, especially when you look up like hop substitutions, for even Tettnanger, any of the noble hops, usually Spalter Select is somewhere in that list of a potential hop substitute because it does have a very nice noble character to it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, his parents are noble, so it's got offspring's got to be a little bit noble-esque.
It's a prince. It's a prince.
There we go.
Noble, it's just a prince.
That's right. We already went over what all of these different terpenes and such do, and so we won't harp on that too much. But to compare it to Tettnanger, Spalter Select's CoH level is going to be between 20 and 28%. That's the same as Tettnanger, basically. Myrcene is going to be 40 to 50% of its hop oils are going to be myrcene. That's about 18% more than Tettnanger, so something to keep in mind for this comparison. It might have a little bit more of that generic kind of hoppy green thing going on. 15 to 20% humulene, which is about 10% less than Tettnanger, so maybe a little bit less herbal, spicy, dank, based purely on humulene alone. About 6 to 8% of the oils are caryophyllene, so that's similar to Tettnanger as well. And then this is an interesting one to me. 10 to 15% of the hop oils are farnesene, which is about 10% less than Tettnanger. That again is that what I feel is what gives Tettnanger its punch, its oomph, is that farnesene level. That's my hunch. I don't know for sure. But that again, that's that kind of sweet, floral, earthy thing that you expect from a good Tettnanger. And so I would expect, personally, that if I'm using Spalter Select in place of Tettnanger, that I might not get as much of that kick, as much of that, what I would expect from Tettnanger at least.
Right. Yeah. So you see some differences here. Again, you see some similarities too, though, like the caryophyllene, the thing I can't pronounce. So I'll just butcher it some more. But you see some similarities too. We didn't touch much on the alpha acidity, but it's kind of still that lower alpha acidity, like 3 to 6.5%. I think the one I used in this one, I don't know if we listed it. It was about 2.6%. Again, for some reason, the drought in Germany, a lot of the hops are just lower alpha acidity. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So, I think for the most part, if you're looking at Tettnanger and Spalter Select, they're going to be largely similar in terms of their stats. Where you're going to see those differences largely are in the humulene content and the farnesene content. I think those are the two to keep in mind mostly. For our THC data, when we had blind tasters evaluate a beer, a pale lager made only with Spalter Select, they chose citrus, tropical fruit, and stone fruit as being the most prominent aromatic descriptors. I think that's really interesting, and it diverges quite a bit away from the spicy, non-fruity, basically, aromatic characteristics of Tettnanger.
Yeah, that actually floored me because, and again, it could be bias. Bias is a hell of a thing. We talk about it all the time on this show. But one of the things that I thought was very prominent in the beer is I had a very floral nose to me. So, who knows what they were tasting? I can't speak on behalf of tasters, but it was very interesting that this came up.
Yeah, the nose, right? That's what
exactly.
Aromatic. So I was up in Yakima and I was having a conversation about exactly that. Like, how do we know when somebody's rating something? They're smelling a beer or smelling hops, smelling a beer made with a specific hop, whatever, and they're trying to rate the descriptors on a Likert scale type of thing. And somebody up there said one thing to keep in mind, right? Citrus starts out as a flower, so if you're smelling floral, you're not too far away from smelling, citrus or tropical fruit, which have blossoms, and those are flowers. So I thought, okay, that's a good way to think about this. There's a lot of overlap in how different people perceive these different characteristics. But I do think it's interesting that the top three most noted aromatic descriptors are all fruit, right? Citrus, tropical fruit, and stone fruit, compared to that spicier, earthy thing that we get with Tettnanger. The least noted aromatic descriptors were onion, garlic, dank caddy, and resinous and grassy. That does line up with kind of some of the lower rated descriptors for Tettnanger as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously those are not anything you really want to smell in your nice German lagers. So right on. I'm so glad it rated low.
Yeah. And then the flavor kind of follows suit here. You're looking at citrus, apple, pear, and stone fruit as being the most prominent flavor descriptors. Blind tasters noted in a beer made only with Spalter Select, and then the least rated descriptors were onion, garlic, resinous, and surprisingly to me, earthy, woody. I expect in any type of noble-esque hop, I expect some element of that kind of sweet, woody or earthy characteristic, and it seems like tasters in this one just didn't pick much of that up.
Yeah, I'm curious too that the stone fruit carried over in both categories as being rated the third most prominent in both aroma and flavor. That's really kind of interesting to me because that's not something I would associate with this hop either. So very fascinating.
Yeah, likewise. And that's why I was so excited for you to do this comparison with these two beers as well, because they were made exactly the same. Now, stylistically, you're looking at the same styles as Tettnanger. I mean, let's just be real here. Pale lager, blonde ale, pale ale, Belgian ale, stuff like that. Spalter Select is basically used, I think, largely as kind of a substitute for noble hops, or in the same way at the very least as noble hops. Do you have any other ideas on that in terms of styles?
I think they're all spot on. Again, it's similar to Tettnanger. I think of pale lager. I think of German pills. I think of some of those things that's where I'm going to use, Spalter Select probably. Like any place where I think a noble hop would go, that's where I'd put it. Although, maybe I do want to try it in an English bitter or a nice pale ale just to see what it does.
Who knows? If you up the amount used, maybe it'll surprise you with the characteristics in parts. Who knows?
At 2.2% alpha acidity, you got to use a lot anyway. So
that 60 minute aroma addition, right?
Exactly. What do I got to add? How many ounces?
Yeah, 4 ounces.
Half pound.
60. Yeah, exactly.
Half pound later.
Yeah. Well, I'll never forget when I realized just how magical Tettnanger really is. It was the first time I used it all on its own. I used it many times prior to that, but it was in a really traditionally brewed Kolsch. I mean, it was just a simple Kolsch recipe. I had some Tettnanger on hand, so I used just Tettnanger. That beer just had something to it that I had not experienced in a beer that I'd brewed before, and I absolutely loved it. It's kind of tough to describe. It's sort of this, like I said earlier, this pungent, noble character that hangs around on the palate a little bit longer than I typically expect. It's just so good. I've also had single hop Spalter Select beers that were great, just different than Tettnanger. Or is it? That's exactly what you tested out in a recent experiment, Will. We're going to be getting into those results when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of work from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. We are very fortunate to live in a time where we have so many different hop varieties available, and while they all have their own distinct characteristics, many also share a lot of similarities. When looking at substitutions for noble hops like Tettnanger, one might find something like Spalter Select, as it was bred from a couple other noble hop varieties. How similar are they? You performed an experiment to see for yourself, Will.
Yes, I've read it over and over and over again online where, oh, you don't have this noble hop, we'll try this other noble hop. Oh, you don't have, you got Spalter Select, well, it's noble enough. And so I've read this stuff over and over again. So I really was curious. So to do this experiment, I brewed up 2 5-gallon batches of International Pale Lager using our Hop Chronicles recipe, because that's kind of what it's designed to do, is evaluate these hops, at least in a lighter IBU range than our Pale Ale recipe. I used 100% Pilsner malt. I think in this case it was Dingman's. And then for the brewing process, I mashed at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius for 60 minutes. And then the mash was complete, I removed the grains and boiled it for 60 minutes. And then this is where during the boils, when I added the variable, I had 65 grams of Tettnanger or Spalter Select at 60 minutes, 10 grams at 30 minutes, and 10 grams at 5 minutes.
So in this one, we were, oftentimes when you're doing a hop comparison, there are differences that are vast enough to make you, we were just talking about this in the crew, Will, because I think you had another idea for a hop comparison where you might want to compare these two hops, but their alpha percentages are just so vastly different that you end up having to use more or less of one to achieve this predicted IBU, which we already know everybody, scientifically is questionable. So in this case, we were lucky enough that the alpha acid percentages were similar enough that you just use the exact same amount of hops at 60, 30, and 5 minutes in the boil for both Tettnanger and Spalter Select. I love that.
Yeah, we got really lucky here because, again, they were both within a fraction of percent of alpha acidity. So the calculated IBUs are only off by 2 or 3. It wasn't enough to even really concern ourselves about or introduce any new variables with. So when the boils are complete, I chilled both worts and took a refractometer reading, and both batches measured in at 1050 OG. It's almost like I've brewed this Hop Chronicles recipe before.
Just a couple, 2 or 3 times, right? Yeah,
exactly. And then I took identical volumes of wort, transferred them into separate Kegland, what do they call it? Kegmenters. And once they were at the desired fermentation temperature of 64F or 18C, I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast L13 Global, which is just a beast of a yeast. I love that sucker.
Yeah, it's so good. And what we found with Global, it was one of the first strains, lager yeast strains, that we were doing some of our fermentation temperature experiments on. And what we found is that we're not alone. Our experiment findings with Global are that you can ferment this stuff cold or warm, and people really struggle to distinguish beers fermented at regardless of the temperature. Now, you go too warm, obviously, and they might be able to. But the reason we selected Global for the Hop Chronicles, which both of these beers were also a part of the Hop Chronicles, as we discussed in the last segment, is because of how robust Global is. And so we've settled on a fermentation temperature, like you mentioned, of 64 degrees Fahrenheit or 18C, which is obviously warmer than the 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9C that traditionalists are going to recommend for lager. But we're very confident that with Global, at least, this is the Weihenstephaner strain, by the way, that we're going to get a nice, clean, non-estery beer in the end. And so both of these were fermented with Global.
Yeah, Global is just fantastic. I'm pretty sure it's the whole reason that cold IPA, which is fermented a little warmer, is accepted as well as it is. So these beers are left to ferment for a week before hydrometer measurements are taken, and both batches ended up at right around 1008 FG. So pretty standard Hop Chronicles beers at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing to know is that, Tettnanger nor Spalter Select had any impact on the strength, the starting strength, or the attenuation of these beers. So there, you got a little bit of data there.
Yeah, there you go. It's almost like that was a more of a malt centric thing there. There you go. So at this point, I cold crashed the beers overnight before pressure transferring them to CO2 purge kegs, and then I placed them in my kegerator. And after a week of cold conditionings, carbed them. They were carbonated and ready for evaluation.
Okay, so I'm looking at the beers right now. There's a photo on this experiment article, which you can find a link to in the description of the episode. They look identical to me. I wouldn't expect them to look any different based on the fact that you used different hop varieties, but the same exact amounts just in the kettle. Pale yellow in color with a really white, foamy head. Nothing too off. They're not bright, but you can tell that there's some condensation on the glass, but underneath that condensation is decently clear beer. They both look great to me.
Yeah, we don't use gelatin findings or anything in these Hop Chronicles beers because we don't want to have any obfuscation of. I don't think it would, but we just don't want to take the chance of it obfuscating any of the flavor or aroma.
Will, we don't want people complaining about it. That's why we don't. We don't do gelatin.
Yeah, I don't want to get the hate mail. You're 100% right. I don't want people complaining that I obfuscated it. So just to take that out, I feel like if we would have added gelatin, they'd probably have been crystal clear and yellow, which would have been even better. And I may or may not have added gelatin to some Hop Chronicles beers after I was done collecting data just so I could enjoy clear beer.
That's right.
But it depends on how lazy I'm feeling. But yeah, they're basically identical in appearance, a little hazier than I'd want, but a beautiful white foam cap on top. Nice, pale straw yellow. They're beautiful beers other than their lack of clarity, but
that's what. Yeah, sometimes we just have to overlook for science, right? That's our thing, is sacrifices that we make. Will. So before we serve these beers to blind tasters, we do a set of what we call semi-blind triangle tests ourselves, and we are full well aware that we are biased. We have our own preconceived notions about what Tettnanger, what Spalter Select are going to contribute to a beer, and so then what we do is we have we have a method that we use. I think all of us have kind of developed our own little method where we do our own set of at least 5 triangle tests where we don't know what beer is in what glass, and we're trying to see if we can identify the unique sample. Again, it's kind of one, I hate this. I'd say it all the time that I don't like doing this, but readers really wanted to see what our thoughts were, as biased as we are. So in this case, you did a set of 5 triangle tests. And how good did you perform on this set of 5 triangle tests, Will?
I wasn't perfect, but I did get 4 out of 5, which would indicate that I could, with some certainty, tell these beers apart. And to me, the Tettnanger beer, I know it sounds strange, it just tasted more beery to me. Like the flavor was more beery, the aroma is more beery, kind of that woody quality along with some floral. While the Spalter Select to me was much more specifically floral on the nose. Like it was really floral on the nose for whatever reason, which kind of flies in the face of some of our Hop Chronicles data. But hey, nobody can argue with my own perceptions, man. They're mine.
They're yours, buddy. You own those things. The thing is, it kind of makes sense, though. Again, like I said earlier, I really do think that floral is a difficult descriptor to nail. I think a lot of people, if you tell one person floral, they might think of the smell of a rose, which you don't get in beer. At least I don't. You might tell somebody else, and they think of potpourri or something like that. To me, floral is kind of a sweet, generic, flowery thing, but it doesn't smell like a bouquet of flowers, at Trader Joe's or something. That's not what I get from floral. So it kind of makes sense to me that you pick that up in both of these beers when more like fruitier characteristics were noted in both of these beers before. What I think is interesting is that you say you got kind of a woody quality from the Tettnanger beer, but did you get any spice in either of these beers? Because that's what I would expect from any Noble-esque type of hop.
So for me, I don't think I got spice. And for me, floral and herbal have a lot of overlap in my, tasting vernacular, so to speak, in my palate. But I didn't really get much in the way of spice, which I was also surprised by, but really more woody and floral. And again, Tettnanger just tastes like beer to me. Like if you, international, pale lager made with Tettnanger just tastes, beer flavored beer, Miller Lite kind of esque, not exactly like Miller. Obviously, Miller Lite's a little lighter, but just that beer flavored beer tastes like what beer should be. That's just how I perceived it. Whereas the Spalter, again, because of it was more aromatic, I would say, because most of, I think, my triangle test that I was successful with, I focused more on the nose than the actual flavor. Because they tasted actually quite a bit similar, but the aromas were starkly different.
Yeah, I'm with you. I feel like one of the things that I've always been after in my brewing is creating beer flavored beer. And I hate what that term has come to mean today. It's like kind of a diss to people who like non-beer flavored beer. I've always been after that beery character, and Tettnanger is definitely a hop that I rely on to achieve that. I'll tell you what, you want to make the beeriest flavored beer of all time, take some Weirmann Pilsner malt, 100%, design a recipe that gets you about 1048 to 1050 OG, use all Tettnanger hops in it, and then ferment it with Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest. You are going to have all of your neighbors will come over and drink that beer. It's so simple. It has all of the qualities of classic beer, as we're describing it at least, and it's very simple to drink. It's just, there's something about Tettnanger, I agree, that does that. And I don't get that quality, whatever we want to call that. I don't get that from Spalter Select, at least in the times that I've used it on its own. And I've used it in Kolsch, I've used it in Pilsner as well. When you got a pound of the stuff sitting around, you do stuff with it. But for me, my recollection at least of Spalter Select when I've used it on its own is that it's just more generic. I actually, when I used it, I was like, I bet I wouldn't be able to tell this apart from a beer made with Spalt, which is a noble hop that I just haven't used that much as well. So, it didn't have that special quality to Tettnanger. So it's curious to me, that you notice these differences fairly consistently, and that they were distinct, despite their similarities. Fascinating. Now, obviously you were biased, and so that's why we serve these beers to a panel of blind tasters who have no idea what the variable is. In this case, you served it to 26 people, out of which 14 would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that there does seem to be a qualitative difference in these beers. And in the end, out of those 26, how many people actually identified the odd beer out?
We had 17, which means we had a significant result. So feeling good to get it right when we have a significant result. It's always embarrassing when you get it wrong and it's a significant result. It's nothing against anybody, but you always just feel a little bad. So, but we seem to say, at least in this experiment with these two beers, tasters could reliably tell them apart, which is pretty awesome. I guess we have preferences. It's interesting with the preferences because even though I preferred the Tettnanger, only 2 tasters preferred the Tettnanger beer. Even though I thought it was wildly better, but it's so weird what people do. And then 12 preferred Spalter Select, and then 2 had no preference despite perceiving a difference, and 1 reported perceiving no difference. So it's so wild to me on preference data because again, I thought the Tettnanger beer is like, this is beery, this is amazing, but then obviously some people just like that more floral aromatic of the Spalter, even. I guess, or the stone fruit character that kind of carried over. Who knows?
So I have a hypothesis as to why the first off, preference is wildly subjective. I mean, that we say that over and over and over again. Whenever somebody's like, "Oh, this is way better," I don't know how you could like something else. But it's because preference is subjective. Stop trying to be so sanctimonious with your preferred beer or whatever. So in this case, I'm not gonna like get too hung up on the fact that 12 people preferred Spalter Select and only 2 preferred the Tettnanger beer. I wonder which one I would have said I preferred if sampling them blind. I think I would say Tettnanger. I'm glad you said Tettnanger because that kind of validates my opinion as well. But man, that is a completely unbalanced. I would have expected to see it split. Just by nature of it being kind of random, I would have expected a bigger split. But man, they're just not. So now, one thing to keep in mind also that I think is interesting, at least with the triangle test, the way it works. A lot of people would say, for like a non-significant finding, they're like, oh, but more than half of the people got it right. Well, you need more than that to achieve significance, particularly since there are 3 cups that people have to choose from. So you're looking for a specific degree more people getting it right than you would expect by random chance, right? In this case, nearly 65% of the people were able to pick the different beer out of 3 when 2 are identical and 1 is the same. That is a good amount of people. I mean, that really does seem to send the message that if you're using Tettnanger on its own in a pale lager in the way that you used it in this experiment, that it is going to have a qualitative difference or be qualitatively different from a beer made with Spalter Select. And what my hypothesis about the preference thing is that when you look back at that THC data that we discussed earlier, Spalter Select had a lot more of the fruity characteristics that I think most modern drinkers tend to expect in beers like pale ale, IPA, stuff like that. It's what is favored for these modern styles of beer. So I wonder if that preference wasn't in some way influenced by what people are used to or what's familiar to them.
Well, and they were served 2 samples of the beer made with Spalter, and so maybe there was something about the Tettnanger that was more intense. That had they had it on its own, sure, but when you have these other 2 cups that are a little less intense, maybe gave them a break. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's incredibly fascinating to say the least.
Yeah, interesting findings, I think, in the end. Any significant finding for us at this point is really interesting, but I guess you wouldn't expect or you wouldn't expect people not to be able to taste 2 wildly different hops apart, but the fact these ones are so similar, I think, does make it more interesting. Now, if you were to go make a single hop pale lager right now, are you picking Tettnanger over Spalter Select, or are you just going to randomly put your hand in the freezer and grab whatever your hand lands on?
I prefer the Tettnanger beer. Tettnanger is one of those hops that I usually have on hand. Spalter Select is more hit or miss for me. So I like Tettnanger. If I'm gonna not use Tettnanger, then I usually reach for another noble variety like Satz. It's just personal preference. Spalter Select, in my biased view, is kind of a little bit further down on the list of things I would choose for noble-esque quality hops.
Yeah, I wish so badly that I lived in San Antonio with you so I could have tried these next to each other. Because I'm so married to this idea that Tettnanger is just it's kind of my favorite noble hop. It's one of my top 5 favorite hops of all time. But what if I would have liked the Spalter Select more? Who knows, right? That's why I'd have to do it myself, I suppose. Now, we did get one reader comment on this one, and it wasn't even critical. It was Daniel said, wow, I was pretty convinced people wouldn't be able to tell a difference, as much more drastic comparisons have failed to achieve statistical significance. Very interesting.
No, I mean, I'm just as floored as he is. And I've read over and over again, all over. I said it more towards the top of the show. You see it a lot where, oh, yeah, these noble-esque hops, you can just kind of interchange them in these recipes. It won't really matter. And obviously here, it does matter to some degree. Now, based off of my experience and me perceiving the nose of the Spalter Select being a bit more floral, maybe I want to use that as a late addition aromatic just to add something to a Helles or something like that and use more Tettnanger as kind of the base malt or the base hop for everything else. So I find this equally as fascinating, and I'm just floored that we got a significant response where 2/3 of people could tell them apart. So that's awesome. Yeah,
I agree with you. One thing that I think about, we did a similar comparison years ago of Galaxy and Mosaic, and people were absolutely utterly floored that did not return a significant result. We may get to that one in a future episode. I was just as surprised. I think Malcolm did that experiment, had a bunch of tasters, and they were just too similar. And I mean, if I think most of us would agree that Galaxy and Mosaic are similar, but they're different. They have their distinct characteristics. But I can't help but wonder if as that pungency increases, which I would contend that both Mosaic and Galaxy are very pungent, whereas Tettnanger, as pungent as I might experience those certain characteristics, Tettnanger and Spalter Select are not necessarily heavy-hitting, pungency hops. I wonder if as that increases, it just becomes more and more difficult to parse out the unique differences when you're having them side by side. I don't know, but the fact that people in this one were able to tell them apart, I think really does suggest that if you're struggling to get kind of a specific noble type of characteristic in your pale lager or Kolsch, maybe try using a different noble hop. You might just tap into that thing that you're looking for. And I think that's a cool thing that these implication of these findings. So that is all the time we've got for this episode. Willow, do you have any last words before we wrap things up?
Nope. Taste is subjective. All these things are subjective. So, if you have a favorite noble variety, keep using it. But if you want to change up, obviously there are some others out there, and they do seem to impart unique characteristics, at least in this experiment.
Amen to that. Now, don't forget to check out the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Cade Job takes you into the lab with experts to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.